The church bells had not even finished ringing when Margaret Ashworth understood that she had already lost. She stood at the back of St. Albans, 3 steps behind her cousin Louisa, exactly where Grandmother Beatrice had positioned her, close enough to the family pew to prove she had not been disowned entirely, far enough back to prove she was not truly welcome either. The congregation filed past her like water parting around a stone. Nobody looked at her directly. That was the worst part, she had come to realize, worse than open cruelty. The way people's eyes slid past her, as though she were a smudge on a window pane, something to be overlooked rather than seen. 6 months. It had been 6 months since the scandal broke over her head like a dropped vase, since her name had become something whispered behind gloved hands at every assembly and card party in the county. 6 months since she had gone from Margaret Ashworth, orphaned niece of a respectable family, to Margaret Ashworth, ruined woman, though she had done nothing at all, to earn that particular brand. You must simply endure it. Louisa had told her that morning, adjusting her bonnet in the hall mirror, while Margaret waited by the door, like a lady's maid, rather than a blood relation. Grandmother says it will pass in time. These things do. But Margaret had heard the servants talking. She had heard enough to know that these things did not pass. They calcified. They became the only fact anyone remembered about a woman, long after the particulars were forgotten. In 50 years, if she lived that long, some elderly gossip would still say, "Oh, Margaret Ashworth, wasn't there some unpleasantness with her?" And no one would recall what the unpleasantness had actually been. Only that it existed. Only that she had been marked by it. The unpleasantness, as her grandmother so delicately called it, had been this. 6 months ago, at the Hartley ball, Margaret's former betrothed, a perfectly unremarkable young man named Frederick Colby, had been discovered in a compromising position with a chambermaid in the conservatory. When Margaret's engagement to him had been quietly dissolved in the aftermath, the story that spread through the drawing rooms of the county was not the true one. It was not that Frederick Colby was a faithless cad who deserved to be horsewhipped by his own father. It was, somehow, through some alchemy of gossip that Margaret had never fully understood, that Margaret herself had done something unforgivable to drive him to it, that she had been cold, that she had been strange, that there was something wrong with her, something that a decent man could not abide. And so he had sought comfort elsewhere. And really, could anyone blame him? She had tried, in the early weeks, to correct the record. She had spoken to her grandmother, begged her to write to the Hartleys, to clarify what had truly happened. Grandmother Beatrice had looked at her over the rim of her spectacles with an expression of such profound weariness that Margaret had never raised the subject again. "Do you imagine," her grandmother had said, "that the truth of a scandal matters even a fraction as much as its shape? The shape is set now, Margaret. You would only make yourself look more pathetic by struggling against it." So Margaret had stopped struggling. She had learned, instead, the particular discipline of quiet endurance. She rose early. She ate what was given to her, when it was given to her, without complaint, even on the days when cook forgot to send a tray up to her room, which happened with suspicious frequency. Whenever Grandmother Beatrice was displeased with her for some infraction, Margaret rarely understood until well after the fact. She wore the dresses handed down from Louisa, taken in at the seams by her own hand, since she was not permitted use of the household seamstress except on Sundays. She spoke when spoken to. She kept her eyes down in company. She had become, in the space of half a year, something like a ghost haunting her own life, present but unacknowledged, moving through rooms that no longer seemed to belong to her. The only place she felt entirely herself was in the meadow behind Ashworth House, where she went in the gray hour before breakfast to draw the wildflowers that grew there in tangled, glorious disorder. She had a small tin box of pencils, a gift from her late mother, one of the only possessions she had managed to keep entirely her own, and a stack of paper she rationed carefully, since new paper cost money, and she had none that was truly hers to spend. She drew the way other women might pray, methodically, devotedly, as though the act itself might save her. Nobody valued this skill. Grandmother Beatrice called it a waste of good paper. Louisa found it faintly embarrassing, the sort of hobby a governess might have, not a lady of even reduced circumstances. But Margaret kept drawing anyway. In the hour before the house woke, because it was the only hour that belonged to her, and because there was something in the precise architecture of a foxglove or a sprig of clover that made her feel less like a ruined woman and more like a person who noticed things, who understood the world in her own particular way, even if no one else valued that understanding. It was in the churchyard, on that particular Sunday morning, that everything changed. She had noticed him before, of course. Everyone had. The Duke of Ravensmoor had taken up residence at Blackwood Park some 2 months prior, a vast estate some 6 miles from Ashworth House that had stood largely empty since the previous duke, his father, had died. In circumstances the county still discussed in hushed, delighted tones. There had been a fire. There had been an older brother who had died young, before he could inherit, in circumstances that were somehow both well known and never fully explained, the way certain tragedies become smoothed over by repetition until they are more shape than substance. Much like Margaret's own scandal. Though, of course, no one would have dared compare a duke's private grief to hers. He was not what Margaret had expected of a duke. She had imagined, based on Louisa's breathless descriptions after the one assembly he had attended, someone languid and bored, dripping with the particular contempt that the very rich reserve for everyone beneath them, which was to say, nearly everyone. Instead, the Duke of Ravensmoor moved through a room like a man perpetually listening for something just out of range, his dark eyes assessing rather than dismissing, his mouth set in a line that suggested not haughtiness, but a kind of permanent watchfulness, as though he expected the world to disappoint him and had made his peace with that expectation long ago. He had never spoken to her. Why would he? She was the girl at the back of the pew, the scandal nobody named directly, the Ashworth cousin who did not attend the same parties as her prettier, better dowered relation. Margaret had assumed, without particular distress, that the Duke of Ravensmoor did not know she existed. She was wrong. The service ended. The congregation began its slow migration into the churchyard, that ritual half-hour of standing among gravestones, exchanging pleasantries that Margaret had come to dread more than almost anything else in her carefully diminished week. It was here, in this open green space beneath the yew trees, that the county conducted its real business, its true worship, the worship of hierarchy and gossip and who stood beside whom. Margaret took her position at the edge of things, near the low stone wall, where she could watch without truly participating. Louisa had already drifted toward a cluster of young ladies near the lychgate, laughing at something one of them had said, her blonde curls catching the morning light in a way that seemed almost designed to remind Margaret of everything she herself lacked. "No man will wed a ruined woman," came a voice at Margaret's shoulder, and she did not need to turn to know it was Louisa's cousin on her father's side, a sharp-tongued girl named Cecilia Pruitt, who had attached herself to Louisa's circle with the tenacity of a burr. "Whatever will you do, Margaret, when your grandmother tires of feeding you? I do hope you have some skill besides sketching daisies." Margaret said nothing. She had learned that silence deployed correctly could be its own kind of shield. Cecilia wanted a reaction, wanted the satisfaction of watching Margaret flinch, and Margaret had become quite accomplished at declining to provide it. "Nothing to say," Cecilia pressed, delighted. "How very wise. I suppose there is nothing to say, is there? It is rather difficult to argue with the truth." It was at this precise moment, with Cecilia's smile still curling with satisfaction, that the crowd near the church door began to shift in part, the way water parts, the way it had parted for Margaret herself not an hour before, except this parting had the opposite quality entirely. This was not the parting of avoidance, this was the parting of deference. The Duke of Ravensmoor was crossing the churchyard. He moved without hurry, his dark coat immaculate, his expression unreadable, and for one absurd moment, Margaret assumed he was walking toward Louisa, or toward the vicar, or toward any one of the half-dozen more sensible destinations his path might have implied. She even glanced instinctively toward Louisa, expecting to see her cousin's face already arranging itself into that particular expression of practiced charm she reserved for eligible men of consequence. But the Duke did not stop at Louisa. He did not stop at Cecilia, whose smile had frozen mid-formation, uncertain now what expression the moment required. He walked directly toward Margaret Ashworth, standing alone by the low stone wall in her cousin's altered blue dress, and he stopped before her and he bowed. Not the shallow, perfunctory nod that men of his rank offered to persons of lesser consequence. A full, deliberate bow. The kind reserved for a woman of the highest standing, executed with such unhurried precision that there could be no mistaking it for accident or misdirection. The churchyard went silent in the particular way that a room goes silent when everyone present understands they are witnessing something they will discuss for years afterward. "Miss Ashworth," the Duke said, straightening, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the small crowd that had gone very still around them, though not so loud as to seem performative. "I hope I find you well this morning." Margaret's mouth had gone dry. She was aware distantly of Cecilia's face beside her, drained of its earlier delight, and replaced with something like confusion curdling rapidly into alarm. Why? She was aware of Louisa turning, her blue eyes widening. She was aware, most of all, of her own heart, which had begun to beat with a violence that felt entirely disproportionate to the moment, except that it did not feel disproportionate at all. It felt like the only proportionate response to a moment that had upended 6 months of careful, grinding humiliation in the space of a single bow. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect. "You are very kind to ask." "I do not believe kindness has anything to do with it," he said, and there was something in his tone, something dry and precise, that suggested this was as close as he came to jesting. "I am merely observant, Miss Ashworth. It is a habit I find difficult to break." She did not know what to say to that. She was not entirely certain what he meant by it, whether it was mere pleasantry or something more pointed, some acknowledgement of the very thing that had made the churchyard fall silent, the strangeness of a duke bowing before the county's designated pariah as though she were the highest lady present. "I wonder," the Duke continued, and here his gaze flickered, just briefly, toward the small sketchbook Margaret carried tucked beneath her arm, as she always did, out of habit, more than intention. "Whether you might tell me something of the flora in this part of the county. I am told you have something of an eye for it." The words landed in the silent churchyard like stones dropped into still water. Margaret felt Cecilia stiffen beside her. She felt Louisa's stunned attention. She felt for the first time in 6 months something that was not quite hope, because hope required a fragility she could not yet afford, but something adjacent to it, something that might, with careful tending, grow into hope eventually. "I draw what I see, Your Grace," she said carefully. "I would not claim any particular expertise beyond that. I have found," the Duke said, "that the ability to see clearly is a rarer skill than most people credit. Expertise can be taught. Clear sight cannot." He bowed again, briefer this time. And then he was moving past her, toward the vicar, exchanging some pleasantry about the sermon that Margaret did not hear over the roaring in her own ears. But he did not look back. He did not need to. He had already done what he came to do, whatever that precise purpose might have been, and the entire churchyard had witnessed it. The walk home was conducted in a silence that felt, to Margaret, like the eye of a storm. Louisa did not speak until they were well clear of the church, out on the lane where the hedgerows blocked the view of anyone who might overhear. Then she rounded on Margaret with an expression Margaret had rarely seen on her cousin's face. Something between astonishment and something sharper, something almost like resentment, though quickly smoothed over. "What was that?" Louisa said. It was not quite a question. "I have no idea," Margaret said honestly. "I have never spoken to him before in my life." He bowed to you, in front of the entire congregation. "Do you understand what that means, Margaret? Do you understand what people will say?" "I imagine they will say a great many things," Margaret said. "Given that they have said a great many things about me already, most of them untrue." Louisa's mouth tightened. "This is different. This is the Duke of Ravensmoor. He does not attend assemblies. He does not call on families. He has not, to my certain knowledge, bowed to a single woman in this county since he arrived, myself included, and I am not," here a flush of genuine irritation, "accustomed to being overlooked. I did not ask him to bow to me, Louisa." "No," Louisa said slowly, and something in her expression shifted, became more considering, more careful. No, I don't suppose you did. They walked the remainder of the way in silence, but it was a different silence than the one that had opened the conversation. Margaret could feel her cousin's sideways glances, could feel the recalculation happening behind Louisa's carefully composed features, and she understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent 6 months learning to read the currents beneath polite conversation, that something fundamental had shifted in how her cousin regarded her. Not affection, not yet, but attention. And attention, Margaret had learned, was the precondition for everything else. Grandmother Beatrice was waiting for them in the drawing room when they returned, her spine as straight as the mahogany chair she occupied, her needlework abandoned in her lap in a way that told Margaret someone had already run ahead with the news. Servants talked. They always talked. It was, Margaret sometimes thought, the only true democracy left in England, the way news traveled faster through the kitchens and back stairs than it ever could through the drawing rooms above. I am told, Grandmother Beatrice said without preamble, that the Duke of Ravensmoor made rather a spectacle of himself this morning. He was very civil, Margaret said carefully. Civil. Her grandmother's eyes, pale and sharp as winter light on ice, fixed on Margaret with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she had learned, painfully, that looking away only invited further scrutiny. A duke does not bow to a girl of your circumstances out of mere civility. Margaret dukes do not concern themselves with civility toward persons who do not matter. What did he say to you? He asked after the local flora. He had heard I sketch. Silence followed. This that Margaret found difficult to interpret. Her grandmother's face, normally so readable in its cold disapproval, had gone carefully blank, the particular blankness of a woman doing rapid calculations behind an impassive mask. He heard, Grandmother Beatrice repeated slowly. From whom, I wonder? Would a duke hear such a thing about a girl he has never met? I do not know, grandmother. No, her grandmother said. I don't suppose you do. She picked up her needlework again, though her fingers did not move, merely held the fabric as though it were a prop in some private performance. You will not seek him out, Margaret. Do you understand me? Whatever peculiar notion has taken hold in his Grace's mind, you will not encourage it. A ruined woman who sets her cap at a duke makes herself not merely pitiable, but ridiculous, and I will not have this family made a laughingstock twice in the same year. I have no intention of setting my cap at anyone, grandmother. See that you don't. Beatrice's gaze slid briefly toward Louisa, who stood by the window with an expression Margaret could not quite read. Louisa, my dear, you look pale. Go and rest before dinner. I wish to speak with Margaret alone. Louisa left without argument, though Margaret caught the flicker of something in her cousin's face as she passed, something that might have been sympathy or might have been calculation, and Margaret found she genuinely could not tell which. When the door closed, Grandmother Beatrice set down her needlework entirely and folded her hands in her lap, a posture Margaret had learned to associate with the delivery of unpleasant instruction. You will understand, her grandmother said, that whatever passing fancy has caught His Grace's attention, it changes nothing about your circumstances. You have no dowry, you have no reputation to offer a man of his consequence. Should he continue this peculiar attention, and I confess I cannot fathom why he would, you are to conduct yourself with the utmost propriety and the utmost distance. Do you understand me? I understand you perfectly, grandmother. Good. Beatrice's eyes narrowed slightly, some new thought passing behind them. There is something else, this business with your parents' estate. I have had a letter from Mr. Harwick. She said the name the way one might mention an unpleasant smell. He writes that there are still certain matters unresolved regarding your inheritance from your mother's side. I have told him, as I have always told him, that the matter is closed, that your father's debts consumed whatever there was to inherit, and that further correspondence on the subject is neither necessary nor welcome. Margaret felt something go very still and very alert inside her chest. This was not the first time she had heard mention of unresolved matters regarding her mother's estate. She had heard it once before, years ago, in a fragment of overheard conversation between her grandmother and the family solicitor that had been quickly hushed when they realized she was within earshot. She had asked about it once, As a girl of 16, newly orphaned and desperate for any thread connecting her to the parents she barely remembered, and her grandmother had told her, in tones that brooked no further inquiry, that there was nothing left, that the Ashworth name was the only inheritance she needed to concern herself with, and that gratitude, not curiosity, was the appropriate response to the roof over her head. She had not asked again. She had learned, as she learned everything in that house, through the slow accumulation of small punishments, that certain questions were simply not permitted. But something in her grandmother's tone now, the particular sharpness with which she dismissed the subject, the way her eyes did not quite meet Margaret's as she spoke, planted a small seed of something Margaret had not allowed herself to feel in years. Suspicion. "Of course, grandmother," she said aloud, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I have never questioned your management of the matter. See that you continue not to," Beatrice said, and rose, signaling the conversation's end. "Now go and change out of that dress before dinner. You've creased it standing about the churchyard listening to nonsense." Margaret climbed the narrow back stairs to her small room at the top of the house. The room that had once, she vaguely recalled, been used for storage before her arrival necessitated its conversion into something habitable, though barely. She closed the door behind her and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands folded in her lap, and allowed herself, for the first time that day, to actually feel the events of the morning rather than simply survive them. The Duke of Ravensmoor had bowed to her. He had asked about her drawings. He had said something about clear sight being rarer than expertise, and she found she could not stop turning the phrase over in her mind, examining it from different angles, the way she might examine an unfamiliar flower before committing it to paper. It meant nothing, she told herself. It was surely some passing curiosity, some momentary diversion for a man who had, by all accounts, very little to occupy him in this quiet corner of the county. It would not be repeated. Tomorrow, the county would find some new subject for its endless appetite for gossip, and the strange interlude in the churchyard would fade into an anecdote, retold perhaps once or twice before it, too, was forgotten. But some small stubborn part of her, the part that had kept drawing wildflowers in the gray hour before dawn, despite every discouragement, the part that had refused to fully extinguish itself, despite 6 months of careful smothering, did not quite believe that. That part of her held the memory of his bow, of his voice, of the particular attention in his dark eyes, and turned it over like a coin, whose true value she had not yet determined, but which she suspected, with a caution she dared not examine too closely, might be considerable. She did not sleep well that night. She rose, as always, in the gray hour before dawn, and made her way down to the meadow with her tin of pencils and her ration paper, moving through the dew-heavy grass with the particular quiet of long practice. The meadow was not truly part of Ashworth land, not that anyone in her grandmother's household seemed to notice or care. It belonged, technically, to the adjoining Hartwell estate, though the Hartwells had let it run wild for years, and Margaret had claimed it as her own private sanctuary through nothing more than habitual trespass. Here, among the foxglove and the clover and the tall grasses, gone silver with dew, she could forget, for the space of an hour, that she was a ruined woman with no future to speak of. She had settled herself against the old stone wall at the meadow's edge, her sketchbook open to a fresh page, when she became aware that she was not alone. "You are trespassing," said a voice behind her, and she turned, her heart lurching, to find the Duke of Ravensmoor standing some 10 feet away, dressed simply without the formal coat he had worn to church, his hair slightly disordered by the morning breeze in a way that made him look, for the first time since Margaret had observed him, less like a duke and more like an ordinary man out walking in the early hours. "Your Grace," she said, scrambling to her feet, her sketchbook nearly slipping from her lap in her haste, "I did not realize this was your land." "It is not," he said. "It belongs to Hartwell, who has not set foot on it in 3 years, by my estimation, given the state of that fence." He nodded toward the crumbling stone wall. "I am equally trespassing, Miss Ashworth, so you need not look quite so alarmed. I am reliably informed I do not bite." There was that dryness again, the almost joke that was not quite a joke, and Margaret found herself, despite everything, suppressing a small smile. "I am relieved to hear it," she said. "I had heard rumors to the contrary." "Had you?" His mouth curved very slightly at one corner. I confess I am curious what rumors circulate about me in this county. I have been here only 2 months, and already I am apparently a subject of considerable speculation. You are a duke who lives alone in a large house and does not attend assemblies, Margaret said. The county cannot help itself. It must speculate about something, and you have made yourself a very convenient subject. As opposed to yourself, he said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, something that told her he had chosen the observation deliberately, who has been made an inconvenient subject for reasons that had nothing to do with your own conduct. Margaret went very still. You have heard the gossip about me, then? I have heard a version of it, he said. I do not know whether it is the true version. I have found that gossip and truth are rarely close companions, particularly where women are concerned. That is a very cynical observation, Your Grace. I am reliably informed I do not make jokes, he said. So I suppose I must make cynical observations instead. It is the closest substitute available to me. Margaret found herself, despite the strangeness of the situation, standing in a wild meadow at dawn conversing with a duke she barely knew, actually laughing, a small surprised sound that seemed to startle them both. Forgive me, she said. I have not laughed in some time. Something shifted in his expression at that. Some flicker of what might have been sympathy or might have been something else entirely, gone before she could properly read it. Then I am glad to have been of service, he said, however unintentionally. He glanced toward her sketchbook, still clutched against her chest. May I see? She hesitated. No one asked to see her drawings. Louisa found them embarrassing. Her grandmother found them a waste of paper. She had grown so accustomed to concealing this particular part of herself that the request felt almost like an intrusion, though not an unwelcome one. She opened the sketchbook and held it out to him, and he took it with a care that surprised her, the way a man might handle something he understood to be fragile and valuable in equal measure. He turned the pages slowly. Foxglove, rendered in precise, careful lines, the bell-shaped flowers captured with an accuracy that went beyond mere prettiness into something closer to botanical study. Clover, its trefoil leaves, shaded to show the subtle variation in their coloring. A study of grasshoppers, she had made one particularly patient, mourning their strange jointed legs rendered with an anatomist's attention. These are exceptional, he said, and there was no flattery in his tone, only a kind of surprised sincerity that Margaret found more affecting than any practiced compliment could have been. You have a scientific eye, Miss Ashworth. This is not merely decoration. This is observation. My mother taught me, Margaret said, and found to her own surprise that she wanted to tell him more, wanted to explain the particular loneliness of that hour before dawn, the way drawing had become the only language she had left that no one could take from her. She was a great believer in looking closely at things. She said most people go through the world only half seeing it. Your mother sounds a wise woman. She died when I was 12, Margaret said. My father followed 2 years later. I have lived with my grandmother since. He said nothing to this immediately, but something in his expression had sharpened, some attention focused. Now that had not been quite so focused before. Ashworth, he said slowly. Your mother. What was her family name before she married? The question was strange enough, specific enough, that Margaret felt the small hairs on her arms rise. Pembroke, she said. Why do you ask, Your Grace? He was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel not uncomfortable exactly, but seen in a way she had not been seen in a very long time. No particular reason, he said finally, though Margaret did not entirely believe him. The name is familiar to me, that is all. I have been reviewing certain old papers since I took up residence at Blackwood Park. My father kept extensive records. Names surface in unexpected places. He closed the sketchbook and handed it back to her, with a formality that seemed almost deliberate, as though he were drawing a curtain over something he had not intended to reveal. I should not keep you from your work any longer, Miss Ashworth, but I wonder if it would not be an imposition, whether I might call upon you and your grandmother at Ashworth House. I find myself curious to know more of the local history, and I understand your family has been established in this county for some generations. Margaret felt a flicker of alarm at the thought of her grandmother receiving the Duke of Ravensmoor, of what Beatrice's reaction might be to such a visit, but she could hardly refuse him. "I am certain my grandmother would be honored, Your Grace." "I doubt that very much," he said, with that same dry precision. "But I appreciate the diplomatic fiction all the same." He bowed briefly this time and took his leave, walking back across the meadow toward the distant shape of Blackwood Park, with the unhurried gait of a man who had all the time in the world and knew precisely how he intended to spend it. Margaret stood in the wet grass for a long moment after he had gone, her sketchbook clutched against her chest, her mind turning over the strange specificity of his question. Pembroke! Why would the name of her mother's family matter to a duke who had never, so far as she knew, had any connection to Ashworth House or its inhabitants before his arrival at Blackwood Park 2 months prior? She thought of her grandmother's face the previous evening, the careful blankness with which she had dismissed the subject of the unresolved inheritance from Margaret's mother's estate. She thought of Mr. Harwick, the family solicitor, and his letters that Beatrice always described as nuisances requiring no response. Something was connected here. Some thread ran between the Duke's sudden pointed interest in her mother's maiden name and the inheritance her grandmother had spent years insisting did not exist. Margaret did not yet know the shape of that connection, but she felt it, the way one feels the presence of a stone beneath still water, invisible but undeniable, and she found herself, for the first time in 6 months, possessed of something like purpose. She would find out what her grandmother had been hiding from her, whatever it cost her. The Duke's visit to Ashworth House took place 3 days later, and Margaret had rarely seen her grandmother in such a state of barely concealed agitation as she was in the hours leading up to it. "You will say nothing of substance," Beatrice instructed her, pacing the drawing room while the maids scrubbed its surfaces that were already spotless. "You will sit quietly. You will not draw attention to yourself. If he addresses you directly, you will answer briefly and defer immediately to Louisa or myself." "And if he does not wish to speak to Louisa or yourself?" Margaret asked, unable entirely to keep the edge from her voice. Beatrice's eyes flashed with something sharp and dangerous. "Do not be impertinent, Margaret. Whatever peculiar fancy has struck his grace, it is not your place to encourage it. You will remember your circumstances." "I remember them every single day." "Grandmother, you have made quite certain of that." For a moment something almost like surprise crossed Beatrice's face, as though she had not expected this particular thread of defiance from a granddaughter she had spent 6 months systematically diminishing. Then her expression hardened again. She said nothing further, merely turned to inspect the tea service with the particular ferocity of a woman determined to control everything within her power, precisely because so much lay beyond it. The Duke arrived promptly at 4 o'clock, and Margaret watched from her position near the window as her grandmother's entire demeanor transformed, the sharp-edged tyrant of the household dissolving into something warm and gracious and entirely false. "Your Grace," Beatrice said, sweeping into a curtsy of surprising depth for a woman of her age and pride. "What an honor you do us, calling on our humble household." "The honor is mine, Mrs. Ashworth," the Duke said, though his eyes, Margaret noticed, had already found her, sitting quietly near the window, with her hands folded in her lap. "I understand your family has held this land for some generations, since my late husband's grandfather's time. Your Grace." "Please, do sit, Louisa. Ring for tea." Louisa, seated primly on the settee in her best afternoon dress, her hair arranged with more care than Margaret had seen her expend in weeks, rang the bell with a graciousness that suggested she had fully recovered from whatever unsettling recalibration the churchyard incident had prompted, and had decided instead to compete for whatever prize the Duke's attention represented. "Miss Louisa," the Duke said, with perfect civility, "I understand you are quite accomplished at the pianoforte." "I do play a little, Your Grace," Louisa said, with the particular modesty that expects immediate contradiction. "I should be delighted to hear you, should the occasion arise." He said this with such perfect neutrality that Margaret could not tell whether it was genuine interest or mere social obligation, and, judging by the slight flicker of uncertainty in Louisa's expression, her cousin could not tell either. The conversation proceeded along familiar lines for some time. The weather, the state of the roads, the health of various mutual acquaintances, and Margaret sat quietly, through all of it, exactly as instructed, watching the Duke's dark eyes move periodically toward her, brief and assessing, before returning to whatever conversational thread her grandmother or cousin had woven. It was nearly half an hour into the visit before he addressed her directly. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and the room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees, Grandmother Beatrice's smile going suddenly rigid. "I understand from our conversation the other morning that your mother's family were the Pembrokes. I wonder if you might tell me something of them. I have been attempting to trace certain old connections since taking up residence at Blackwood Park, and the name has come up more than once in my father's papers." The room went very quiet. Margaret was aware of her grandmother's hand, which had gone still on the arm of her chair, the knuckles suddenly pale. "I am afraid I know very little of my mother's family, Your Grace," Margaret said carefully. "She died when I was young, and my grandmother has been my guardian since." "That is a shame," the Duke said, his eyes flickering very briefly toward Beatrice. "I had understood the Pembrokes to be a family of some consequence some generations back. There was, I believe, a considerable estate involved. Pemberley Hall, I think it was called, in Kent." "I am not familiar with any such estate," Margaret said. And this was entirely true, though something in the Duke's tone, the deliberate precision of his phrasing, suggested that he expected her ignorance, that he had, in fact, anticipated it. "Perhaps your grandmother might enlighten us," he said, turning his attention now to Beatrice, with a mild, unhurried courtesy that somehow managed to feel entirely like a challenge. "You would have known Mrs. Ashworth's mother, I imagine, when she married into the family. Do you recall any particulars of the Pembroke estate?" Beatrice's composure was, Margaret had to admit, remarkable. Her smile did not waver, though something behind her eyes had gone hard, and calculating in a way Margaret recognized from years of careful study. "I am afraid my memory for such particulars is not what it once was, Your Grace," she said smoothly. "My daughter-in-law's family connections were never a subject of great importance in this household. We are simple country people, Your Grace. We do not concern ourselves overmuch with distant estates and old family histories." "How curious," the Duke said, "that a family of Pembroke's former consequence should simply fade from memory so entirely." "Families do fade, Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice cooling by several careful degrees. "Fortunes are made and lost. It is the way of things." "Indeed it is," the Duke agreed, and there was something in his tone, something quiet and watchful, that told Margaret this line of inquiry was not finished, merely paused, set aside for a moment more advantageous to its pursuit. He did not raise the subject again for the remainder of his visit, though Margaret noticed him watching her grandmother with a particular attention throughout, the way a man watches an opponent across a chessboard, calculating moves several steps ahead of the pieces currently in play. When he took his leave, some 40 minutes later, he bowed over Louisa's hand with perfect correctness, and then turned to Margaret, and his bow to her, though briefer than the one in the churchyard, carried the same unmistakable weight. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I wonder if you might do me the kindness of showing me the meadow again tomorrow morning. I find myself in need of instruction in the local flora." Margaret felt her grandmother's gaze on her like a physical weight, but there was nothing to be done. To refuse the Duke's request in front of the Duke himself would have been its own kind of scandal, and Beatrice, for all her fury, would not risk that. "Of course, Your Grace," Margaret said. "I am generally there at first light." "Then I shall endeavor to match your habits," he said, and took his leave, and the moment the door closed behind him, Grandmother Beatrice's carefully maintained composure shattered entirely. "What have you told him?" she demanded, rounding on Margaret with a fury Margaret had rarely seen unleashed so openly. "What have you said to encourage this line of questioning?" "I have told him nothing, Grandmother, because I know nothing." "You have made quite certain of that. Do not use that tone with me." "What tone would you prefer, Grandmother? I have asked you for 6 years about my mother's family, and you have told me every time that there is nothing to know. Now a duke arrives in this county and begins asking questions about a Pembroke estate in Kent, an estate I have never once heard mentioned in this house, and you expect me to believe there is nothing in it." Beatrice's face had gone very pale, 2 spots of angry color high on her cheeks. "You will not speak to me in this manner, Margaret. I have kept you, fed you, clothed you, for 6 years, out of nothing but charity, and this is the gratitude I am shown? I have never questioned the charity, grandmother. I have only asked for the truth." "The truth," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to something low and dangerous, "is that your mother's family disgraced themselves generations ago, and there is nothing left to discuss. The Duke of Ravensmoor is engaging in idle curiosity, nothing more, and you would do well not to encourage delusions of grandeur that will only end in further humiliation for yourself. Pray him." But Margaret had seen her grandmother's hands, trembling very slightly despite the steadiness of her voice, and she understood, with a certainty that settled into her chest like a stone, that Beatrice was lying. Whatever the truth of the Pembroke estate might be, it was not nothing. It was something significant enough to make her grandmother's hands shake at the mere mention of it. That night, Margaret lay awake in her narrow bed, turning over every fragment of information she possessed. The unresolved matters Mr. Harwick's letters kept raising, the Pembroke name and its vanished estate in Kent. Her grandmother's carefully maintained fiction that there was nothing left to inherit, nothing worth discussing, nothing worth the energy of curiosity. She thought of the old trunk in the attic that she had glimpsed once, years ago, during a rare excursion into that dusty, forgotten space to retrieve some seasonal linens. A trunk marked with initials that were not Ashworth initials, tucked into a corner and covered with a moth-eaten sheet, the sort of object that exists in every large house, unremarked upon, unexplained, simply present. She rose before dawn, as always, but instead of making her way to the meadow, she climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, her candle throwing long, trembling shadows across the accumulated debris of generations. It took her nearly 20 minutes to locate the trunk again, buried now beneath newer detritus, but she found it eventually, in the same corner, still marked with those unfamiliar initials. M.P. Margaret Pembroke. Her mother's initials, before marriage. Her hands trembled as she worked the rusted latch, and when it finally gave way with a small protesting groan, she found herself looking down at a collection of papers, letters bound with faded ribbon, a small portrait miniature of a woman who bore an unmistakable resemblance to Margaret's own reflection, and beneath all of it, folded carefully at the bottom of the trunk, a document sealed with wax that had long since cracked and crumbled, revealing words that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. Last will and testament of Edmund Pembroke. Her mother's father, her grandfather, whom she had never known, whom she had never even heard named in 6 years beneath her grandmother's roof. She read as much as she dared in the gray candlelight, her heart pounding. And what she read confirmed everything she had begun to suspect, and more besides. The Pembroke estate, Pemberley Hall in Kent, along with a substantial accompanying fortune, had been left entirely to Margaret's mother, and upon her death, to Margaret herself, to be held in trust until she reached the age of 25 or married, whichever came first. Margaret was 22 now. She had 3 more years to wait, unless she married, and in either case the fortune and the estate were unmistakably, undeniably hers. Her grandmother had known. Her grandmother had known for 6 years and had said nothing, had told Margaret instead that she survived on charity, had made Margaret feel the weight of gratitude for scraps that were never charity at all, but Margaret's own inheritance, withheld and concealed while her grandmother controlled every aspect of her diminished existence. She heard distantly the sound of movement below, the household beginning to stir, and she hastily gathered the papers, the miniature, everything she could carry without arousing suspicion, and made her way back to her own room, her mind racing, her hands still trembling with the enormity of what she had discovered. She did not go to the meadow that morning. She could not risk being seen with the documents still in her possession, could not risk her grandmother's suspicion falling upon her before she had determined what to do with what she now knew. She hid the papers beneath a loose floorboard, beneath her bed, hiding place she had discovered years ago and used until now, only for the small treasures a girl with nothing else might value. A pressed flower, a lock of her mother's hair, small things that meant nothing to anyone but her. But her absence from the meadow did not go unnoticed. She learned, later that day from one of the under housemaids, a kind girl named Sarah who had always shown Margaret small, quiet kindnesses that Margaret suspected were their own form of quiet rebellion against the household's prevailing cruelty, that the Duke of Ravensmoor had, in fact, walked to the meadow at dawn and waited some considerable time before returning to Blackwood Park. "He looked disappointed, miss," Sarah said, folding linens with quick, efficient hands, her voice pitched low so as not to carry beyond the small laundry room where she had found a moment to speak privately with Margaret. "I saw him from the kitchen garden, stood by that old wall a good half-hour. He did, before he gave it up." Margaret felt a small pang of guilt at this, disproportionate perhaps to the circumstances. But she had no way of sending word to him, no way of explaining without revealing far more than she yet dared to reveal to anyone. "Sarah," she said carefully, "how long have you served in this house?" "Since I was 12, miss, near 10 years now. Did you know my mother before she died?" Something shifted in Sarah's expression, a flicker of caution that told Margaret she had touched on something the girl had been trained, like everyone else in this house, not to discuss. "I was very young, miss, when your mother came to live here after her marriage. I remember her a little. She was very kind, kinder than most ladies of the house, if I may say so." "Do you remember anything of her family?" "Her people before she married my father?" Sarah's hands had gone, still on the linens, and she glanced toward the door as though checking for listeners. Before she spoke again, her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I remember there was talk, miss, when I was very young, that your mother had come from a grander family than the Ashworths, that there had been some falling out, some old grievance, before your parents married. Mrs. Beatrice never liked to speak of it. I heard old cook mention it once years back, before she passed, but she was told sharp to hold her tongue, and she never spoke of it again in my hearing." "Do you know what the falling out concerned?" "No, miss, I only know it was spoke of in whispers, and never in front of the family." Margaret nodded slowly, filing this fragment away alongside everything else she had discovered, of falling out. Some old grievance between her mother's family and the Ashworths. It was not much, but it was another piece of a puzzle that was slowly, painfully assembling itself into a shape she was only beginning to comprehend. "Sarah," she said, "I must ask you something, and I need you to trust me that I would not ask if it were not important. Would you be willing to help me, if I needed it? I cannot promise it would be without risk to yourself." Sarah studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, some old loyalty surfacing that Margaret had not fully anticipated. "Your mother was kind to my own mother, miss, when my mother took ill one winter years back. Sent food down from the house without Mrs. Beatrice's knowing if the old stories are true. I'd not forget a kindness like that, even second-hand. Whatever you need, miss, within my power, I'll help." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, some tension she had not fully realized she was carrying. "Thank you, Sarah. I may need to ask you to carry a message for me, discreetly. To the Duke, miss." Margaret felt herself flush slightly. Perhaps, among other things, Sarah's mouth curved into the first genuine smile Margaret had seen from her in some time. "I'll manage it, miss. Don't you worry." The message, Margaret eventually composed, 3 days later. Once she had steadied her nerves enough to determine precisely how much she dared reveal, was carefully worded, revealing enough to convey urgency without exposing everything she had discovered to the risk of interception. "Your Grace," she wrote, "I find I must apologize for my absence from our appointed meeting. Circumstances beyond my immediate control have arisen that I believe may bear directly upon the questions you raised during your visit to Ashworth House. If it would not be an imposition, I would be grateful for the opportunity to speak with you privately, away from my grandmother's household, at your earliest convenience." She signed it, simply, "Margaret Ashworth," and gave it to Sarah folded, small enough to conceal within her apron, with instructions to deliver it to Blackwood Park through whatever discreet means the servants' network might provide. The response came the following morning, delivered in the same discreet manner, and Margaret's hands trembled as she unfolded it. Miss Ashworth, the Duke had written, in a hand that was precise and economical, much like the man himself. "I confess I had begun to suspect that certain unwelcome pressures might be at play in your household regarding our previous conversation. I would be glad to speak with you at whatever hour and location you deem safest. There is an old folly on the eastern edge of Blackwood Park's grounds, near the boundary with Hartwell's land, that affords considerable privacy. I will await you there each morning at dawn until you are able to come. Please take whatever precautions you require. I have grown, in recent weeks, rather more invested in your circumstances than I initially anticipated, and I would not have you take unnecessary risks on my account." Margaret read the letter 3 times before she allowed herself to fold it away, her heart beating with an unfamiliar combination of fear and something that felt dangerously close to hope. It took her 4 more days to arrange an opportunity to slip away undetected, 4 days during which her grandmother's suspicion seemed to sharpen with each passing hour, as though Beatrice sensed some shift in the household's currents that she could not yet name, but instinctively distrusted. "You have seemed distracted of late, Margaret," her